both to the company and to their credit, they came to the Interagency Security Committee very much with a transparent concern for these types of events. And then collectively, we started to look at what are the requirements in the federal acquisition regulations. There are none really. What are their requirements within HSPD 12 revocation? It's 18 hours is the requirement, and we realize that sometimes that's probably too long. And so what we did is we looked at across organizations to find example best practices, and we were able to do that. We were able to ensure that this particular resource would give organizations a roadmap to develop the processes and procedures to deal with medium or high risk employees. So we're not really worried about low risk employees. 99% of employee separations are low risk, and they're largely a human capital led endeavor. However, when we get into medium and high risk employees, we need to understand what would cause somebody to be a medium or high risk, right? So we need some protocols. And then we need to have the processes in place so that we deal differently and separately and appropriately with the medium or a high risk separation. This document covers the best practices for conducting employee risk separation risk assessments, a protocol for categorizing risk, and I'll show you an example of that here in a second. It also talks about keys to success for notifying the employee, managing access to facilities and information technology systems, as I just mentioned, and even post-separation vigilance. So the risk doesn't go away after the employee has been notified or has been separated or has had their equipment and credentials revoked. The guide also includes advice for a risk-based removal and departing security checklist. So again, making sure that we've got a tool out there that organizations can use. Your organization can use this. This is not limited. The risk from adverse separations is not limited to government agencies for sure. And this document, as 99% of our guidance documents, are available on our public-facing website, so they're definitely there for you to use. The first thing that the document recommends is that the organization develop a medium or high risk or involuntary separation, whatever term you want to use to label it. But basically, to develop the process for a non-routine separation. Assign responsibilities to appropriate parts of the organization, and figure out who's going to have primacy for these activities. And we don't come down on one side or the other. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach for who might need to have primacy in these instances within the organization, because organizations really vary, right? And it's not even necessarily an easy thing to immediately implement. I had one organization that I was talking to them about this particular document. They realized that they needed to have the processes in place, and they were looking forward to implementing a program. But they said, but first I've got to form a relationship with my human capital folks. So I was talking to the security office, and that's exactly right. This is really cross-organizational coordination, and there's a lot of things that have to go in place before you can actually get the process and the procedures in place. But clearly, we need to have timelines for removing physical and logical access. And what do those timelines look? A high-risk individual, the timelines may be very, very short, and they may be longer or they may be the same as a medium risk. And then you can see on this table, which again is an example of the types of things that might qualify for a low, moderate, or high risk. So certainly, somebody who's removed because of a substantiated investigation or serious conduct issues or behavioral issues might fall in a high category. somebody who's being laid off due to budget cuts or reduction in force, or somebody that the supervisor is transferring to another part of the organization, might fall in the moderate category, the medium category, and then kind of all of those routine types of separations fall into the low category area. This is a start point. We recommend that organizations take this as a start point and then develop the types of things that would be high, moderate, and low risk based on the nature of that organization. The exiting checklist, there is an exiting checklist in the appendix that just kind of shows different timelines and activities associated with different risk levels. And then we certainly have a section in there to talk about the types of things that you may do, may want to implement as part of your post-separation vigilance plan. Next guidance I want to talk about, in August, the committee published a document on federal mobile workplace security. This was actually a enumerated requirement out of the new executive order that I mentioned earlier. This particular bit of guidance offers organizations security considerations, both physical and cyber. It also talks about continuity planning and how that can be leveraged via workplace flexibility options. We worked with our members to form a federal mobile workplace security working group to develop this guidance. We had approximately 15 agencies represented, both large and small, on this particular working group. And we were able to bring all the right experts to the table as well. This new publication, and I'll kind of show you on the next slide here, for security professionals, it may not strike the right chord, but our audience was not just security professionals. Our audience was also supervisors and individual employees. So when we talk about physical security things that folks should consider for their home, in terms of crime prevention through environmental design, for a large segment of the audience is going to be actually trying to implement some of these measures that may be fairly new to them. Clearly, our security professionals, it will not. We spent a fair amount of time talking about segmenting the home network. We really need to look at those high-risk items, such as Internet of Things, that maybe don't have the same security level of security protocols as your MacBook, and keep them on a different part of the network. And we also want to encourage our workforce to keep their personal work separate from a network perspective from their work devices. Certainly some concerns and sensitivities around voice-enabled smart devices as well. And then recognizing that some folks are going to work in public spaces. We also spend a bit of time in this document talking about ways to secure information while working in public spaces. The third resource that I want to talk about in terms of what the committee has provided this year was an update. This was the previous two items were actually new documents that were developed. This third document is on occupant emergency planning. And we had a previous version, but it needed to be updated. It was out of date, and it needed to account for workplace flexibilities. How do we adjust, amend, and otherwise change the way we approach our occupant emergency planning and procedures when we might have a changing census in a facility on any given day? And so traditional methods such as floor wardens might work if you've got a large enough presence to have a floor warden of the day, and you can have that dedicated occupant emergency staffing on every day. In some cases, that's not going to work in a modern work environment. So how do we adjust for that? What are some other things that we can do to ensure that we have the type of occupant emergency planning and processes in place to account for kind of the new normal in terms of the work environment? So a number of things that we recommend in this particular document in terms of hybrid approaches, in where you can increase the size of the occupant emergency staff. A lot of folks are using workplace reservation systems. Can we self-identify occupant emergency staffing when they reserve space in the office? So self-nominate themselves. Clearly, there's a need to expand our mechanisms for mass warning and notification. If we have people in lots of different places, how does mass warning and notification work? And what's the role of the supervisor? And how can we leverage technology to do that better? We have a number of vignettes within the document of agencies who have successfully navigated a lot of these occupant emergency challenges. Um, and then uh, some of our agencies have been able to leverage access control data, visitor information, and alert notification systems really to automate their accountability. Um, we spend some time in here talking about the need to account for special populations, those that maybe have physical challenges, or there may have some language barriers in some of our spaces. Finally, many organizations have gone away from a dedicated occupant emergency staff and are taking more of an all hands preparedness approach. They may have an annual safety stand down day and access to uh, specialized equipment, training, stop the bleed kits. Even seeing some organizations use QR codes where people could access the occupant emergency plan, maybe on the back of an identification holder and places like that, so that everybody can have ready access to the information they need in the event of emergency. So that's a quick background for you on the Interagency Security Committee, our role within the executive branch, and with our 66 member departments and agencies. We support that effort here out of CISA. And there's a QR code that will take you to our public facing website, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Daniel. Great information there. So you were talking about mobile work, hybrid work, a fair amount there. How much more challenging has that made security in the federal space for ISC for agencies in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that it has been challenging, right? If for no other reason that it's hard to have a conversation about facility security when folks are spending less time in the facility. So that has made it a challenge. Fewer eyes on things, right? See something, say something. That has become a greater challenge with fewer folks uh, actually in the space to sort of provide and that identification in other cases. So certainly has been a challenge. I think most agencies are making some adjustments based on that. And certainly we are seeing greater increased return to the office. And that seems to be having a positive effect when it comes to security, and we expect that will continue in the future. So all of that is producing a number of things. It's producing a greater request for the training that we provide to stakeholders. That training is also available on our public-facing website. You can see when there is a virtual instructor-led training course coming up and when there's an in-person training course coming up. These are half-day courses that are IACET approved. They do offer continuing education credits for those who need to maintain those for their certifications, and it's open to all. It's we've had clearly the majority of the folks that attend that training are federal facility stakeholders, but we've had Google security, we've had state police, we've had a lot of private sector attend the training as well to kind of better understand the risk management process that the federal government is using, benchmark off it in some cases, and or to try to determine where they might be able to add value to that process through either the services or goods that they provide.
Great. All right, so we have a couple questions here. I'll start off with a pretty technical one. The perimeter security industry has seen the emergence and implementation of UFC 40106, cybersecurity of facility-related control systems on DoD projects, which requires IP and non-IP related control systems to comply with an identified level based on the design and connectivity. It includes security, HVAC, lights, etc. Is this a requirement across all government agencies, or is that just DoD?
It is just DoD, but what I can tell you is in our technical standards, there we address cybersecurity, in particular of what we call building automated control systems, so BACs. And so part of our countermeasures approach, it really focuses on those BAC systems and how we treat them. So we do provide guidance. It's not UFC level guidance, but we do provide guidance to help ensure that those don't become points of vulnerability within the network. And our countermeasure subcommittee is doing quite an update this year of the technical standards. So looking forward to that work being made available to our stakeholders. That information, unfortunately, is FOUO, so we rarely release that to the private sector, but we do address it in our countermeasures.
All right, another question. Are selected recommendations for security in remote workspaces going to be part of telework agreements for federal employees?
Yeah, well, we certainly think it should be. And that's one of the reasons that we provided that guidance was so that agencies could incorporate that guidance. You know, there's a lot of things you have to self-certify when you do a telework agreement, and things like OSHA requirements, right? So safety and health things that a lot of agencies currently require folks to self-certify in terms of their home workspace. So we don't see why security requirements can't also be incorporated into that particular organization's approach to allowing either remote work or telework.
All right, one more question. Are there any opportunities for security companies, such as manufacturers and integrators, to work with ISC to provide technical expertise in the development of security recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'll do is I'll ask that if you're interested in doing that, that you reach out to our general inquiry box there, so that we can find out what's the appropriate place to link you up. In some cases, we've got ISC regional advisors located across the country. So depending on where you're at, we might link you up with an ISC regional advisor. From time to time, we bring industry in to our working groups and our subcommittees and get them to provide their expertise and to share that expertise with our stakeholders.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for all the great information today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks, Daryl. We'll see you next time. All right, up next, we have another member of the CISA team. Dan Genua is a protective security advisor for the agency. He works with partners across the Washington, D.C. area to identify and manage risks to critical infrastructure and key cyberspace assets. He has worked in support of the Department of Homeland Security since 2009, and his primary area of focus has been the design and conduct of critical infrastructure vulnerability assessments. Prior to joining DHS, he served in the U.S. Peace Corps in the West Indies. Welcome, Daniel. And I think you're still muted.
There. How am I sounding now? Can you hear me now?
Much better. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank you, Ron, for having me on, and thank Daryl for the fantastic presentation. So it's a great opportunity to learn about the Interagency Security Committee from a colleague. And one thing that I'll say, about CISA and about all of us in the security industry is we don't take enough time to really learn from one another sufficiently. So it was great. I've worked with Daryl for many years and I haven't heard that presentation at least over the last year. So always a great time to learn something. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to folks today. If you're a longtime SIA member, I typically work with a great colleague Rob Ryder from SIA on the perimeter security kind of sub-function or focus area, and always look forward to hearing from my peers there, and I'm glad to continue to be our partner with you folks. I'm going to talk to you today about something a little bit less technical, about the common themes and findings that my team is eliciting when we visit with government facility partners. And so let's see if I can go ahead and change my, if you're looking at my slides on agenda, I'm just going to talk with you about the engagements that we've conducted recently, the common themes and findings from those assessments, and then relevant resources. And again, I think it's in the theme of trying to learn from our peers. CISA has an incredible opportunity. If you haven't worked with CISA before, we have 5 key mission areas, right? So our first one is to conduct outreach and engage critical infrastructure owners and operators. And we do that so the federal government has a perspective on concerns to critical infrastructure at the industry level. So we really prioritize private sector partners, but really all infrastructure owners and operators are within that purview. So engagement to figure out who's who in the zoo. Then we conduct assessments to determine kind of a baseline where infrastructure owners and operators and industry is with regard to security, and how can we make tailored recommendations to improve those things. We then deliver capacity building resources, our third line of effort, and capacity building resources typically in terms of investment justification or training or planning support or exercise, and then of course bring those perspectives to our last 2 mission areas, which is special event support. And so I was privileged to support the 125th plane of the Army Navy game this weekend. The Navy looked really strong out there. Sorry to any Army folks on this webinar. And then of course during incident response, where we take these perspectives on infrastructure and we put on a hat that helps us advise decision makers on cascading effects and consequences. So we have this really great opportunity though, where we're spending a lot of time by the nature of our mission learning about what different folks are doing to create a secure and resilient area of responsibility or area of operations. And I'm just going to share that with you today from the perspective of government facilities. So you can see some data on this slide right here. CISA has, we conduct, all of us, hundreds of individuals. So there's protective security advisors, cybersecurity advisors, communication specialists, and chemical security advisors now across the nation. We have at least a minimum of 1 person in every state in every major city. And so depending on how you define a major city, we're talking about a workforce now that's rapidly approaching 750 employees, regionally assigned. That means working in your hometowns. And you can see this year, just since 1 January 2024, we've met with 5,000. We've had 5,000 engagements with folks who would kind of fall under the sphere of government facilities. Those aren't 5,000 unique engagements, just so we're clear about that. So I've had personally a dozen engagements at Metropolitan Police Department facilities, right? And so there's one organization, 12 different facilities that we visited, and so they start to duplicate. But you can see 5,000 times this year we've been speaking with folks about security in the domain of government facilities. So it's a lot of man hours put towards this mission space. For the purpose of today's presentation, I've reviewed data that our agency has collected. And so we're looking at specifically office buildings, service-oriented buildings, and research facilities. So seeing we're talking about kind of government as a vertical structure, and we had to scope out quite a bit. I had to scope out quite a bit of perspective because if anybody's been paying attention to CISA, you know that we focused a lot on the election in 2024, and gosh, you know, even in my area of responsibility, we visited with, you know, office buildings, you know, election-oriented office buildings, and schools, and recreation centers and community centers in and around the National Capital Region. Those things all kind of count as government buildings, government facilities, but I didn't think that they were within the scope of this particular group. We scoped out museums and icons because they're so unique in terms of the way that they're protected, and academic facilities because it's tough for our data to segment between, it's a public owned, you know, a university. There's lots of different types of functions at university, but so I didn't need you guys considering the security characteristics of Byrd Field out there in Maryland, the University of Maryland. Maybe it has a different name now. I think it does. But you can see a disproportionate percentage of our assessments are looking at state, local, and tribal and territorial government facilities. So you can see out of 3,500, I'm sorry, engagements. So we've scoped out international engagements too, and like I said, academic engagements. 3,500 engagements featuring state, local, tribal, territorial, 550 featuring other. And then you can see kind of the breakdown where those missionaries we're talking about kind of break into further activities: stakeholder development, which is outreach; surveys and assessments, which I'm going to get into; strategic messaging is kind of our capacity building, making sure we're passing key messages to them, and then relaying information via external committees and working groups with these types of projects. So you can see a lot of our time spent on outreach, and then once we've made that connection, then those subordinate activities kind of follow suit. So anyway, just trying to clarify the amount of time that CISA spent building this perspective. The perspective I'm focused on sharing is about what have we learned from the visit with these partners, the visit with these facilities, with our engagement with government facilities over the last year. And so let's talk about visiting nearly 5,000 sites. About 947 of those site visits were associated with assessments. And so that's either us going out to conduct an assessment or brief out the results of assessment over the last year. And so we're spending a lot of time talking about the conditions of threat, vulnerability, and consequence at these types of facilities. CISA, when I talk about CISA, you think about cybersecurity, think about infrastructure security. We love security. We say it twice, but it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room in 2024, which is our agency's really focused on cybersecurity right now. And that's because it's still a massive blind spot in terms of vulnerability for the federal government. So we're focused a lot on that. We're doing two types of assessments, still physical assessments and cyber assessments. Our physical assessment, if you've never received one, is a hybrid. It's a hybrid assessment. It's an interview-based assessment to talk about your policies, plans, and procedures, things that are transparent to our eyes. And then an evidence-based assessment where we're conducting site walkthroughs to identify vulnerabilities. We're looking at the outside in, the path of least resistance to significant areas or assets, whether that's your people or sensitive data or sensitive machinery, irreplaceable components, right? And then our cyber assessments, we have the capability to put hands on a keyboard. That capability is primarily deployed from our headquarters unit, and so those folks kind of operate outside of my purview. And our primary cybersecurity assessments in the field are questionnaire format. They would be better characterized as surveys to determine risk awareness, governance, safeguard governance being policies, procedures, and plans on the cybersecurity side. Safeguards for data, and then your detection, response, and recovery capabilities and procedures. So we're looking at what's where are you and where can we make tailored recommendations to get your facility or your organization better, right? Now I'm going to summarize the findings from physical security assessments, and I hope that's acceptable, folks, on this call. And I hope you appreciate this. On the cybersecurity side, we're still just now, only 4 years in. We've been doing this on the physical security side since 2006, but on the cybersecurity side, we're still just developing enough of a comparative data set, enough of a perspective, broad enough perspective that we can start to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So we're still light and my particular field of expertise is light in terms of I haven't conducted enough cyber assessments personally, and our data set is still kind of underdeveloped to provide a perspective. So for the most part, I'm going to stick to the cyber performance goals when I talk about cybersecurity, and try to compel folks to take a hard look at that if that's not something your organization's already doing. All right. So what's the good news when we conduct these assessments at government facilities? And again, we're trying to compare apples to apples and looking at government facilities and the state of risk there against your peers in other sectors and other industry. And so some good news first. So government facilities typically are more likely, well, first of all, more likely to have plans because we're government folks and we like to have a plan. And so some sort of planning has occurred at most government facilities that we visit. That's healthy. There's nothing worse than when someone says, I want to conduct an exercise. And we say, okay, what are we going to exercise? And say, we're going to exercise our emergency action plan. And then we ask them to produce the plan and they don't have a plan. And so can't do it, right? So some sort of planning has typically been developed or has typically occurred at the facility. Some level of information exchanges occur. Again, because government facilities very rarely operate in a vacuum. You're not an individual entity, right? And so there's some sort of information that's occurring to exchange risk perspectives. Most personnel-oriented government facilities have some sort of on-site security personnel, at least in the national capital region. That trend starts to diminish as you start to scale out towards middle America. But when we have personnel that work in government facilities, they're comparatively more likely to have on-site security personnel than many of your industry peers. And then of course, in government, we've been good about developing relationships with our law enforcement and first responders. So again, these are just some observations, generic observations that we can make about government facilities, compared to other types of critical infrastructures before we get ready to conduct an assessment. On the flip side, there are some trends, and again, our body of knowledge and my particular efforts have been primarily oriented on state, local being county or city, and then tribal territorial, not so much in the DC area, engagements that we've had over the last year. Here are some opportunities for improvement that are common through these assessments. So the first one is information flow. Relationships deteriorated during the COVID shutdown. They're slow to come back online. What I'm talking about here is a lot of our partners, especially at the state and local level, used to participate in the equivalency of neighborhood watch associations. It could be your LEPC, your local emergency planning council. It could be your business improvement district security working group. It could be some sort of geographic area security committee. And these folks, it could be a government association, government security directors kind of working group. And these working groups just kind of fell apart during COVID, and they are slowly coming back online. But they're not to where they were. And so the level of information exchange that we observed pre-COVID, we're not observing that same type of information exchange due to relationship atrophy over the last 4 years at this point. And so really pushing folks to rejoin the community. Similarly, internally, relationships have kind of deteriorated or atrophied, and they need to be reestablished. And so we're talking about here is, as folks went to work remotely, pushed out remotely, the frequency of engagement between the site security manager, the operations manager, operations director, human resources, general management, and leadership, those conversations have become fragmented, right? And so there's not a common or holistic perspective on risk management at a lot of the facilities that we're going to. I'm seeing a note in the chat, and we'll go ahead and clear the chat after this. But I appreciate Drew, chime in to say InfraGard and organizations like InfraGard are huge, right? At not to use like I'm Italian and I have a mother, so not to talk about my Italian mother, but they guilt you back to the table. You haven't spoken to your mother in a long time. Same idea. You haven't come to an InfraGard meeting. You've skipped a few planning meetings. We sure would love to have you back and hear what you're doing. What best practices and effective solutions you're implementing. So anyway, bringing those things to the table. The second one is plans. plans are due for an update. And so the question we ask folks, I mentioned about this with tabletop exercise, we talk about four types of plans, really. It's a security management plan, continuity of operations plan, emergency action plan, and some sort of annex to that, which is a crisis communication plan. How are you exchanging information? Again, for the most part, when we're talking about, do you have a plan? So your security management plan is talking about the strategies that you've deployed to utilize capabilities to prevent things from happening at your organizational level. Yeah, we all know what emergency action plan is, continuity of operations plan. When we ask about these plans, folks say, yeah, I have one. And then the plans were written before 2020. And we all know that in 2020, the entire way that we operate these facilities has shifted. Now, in some places, some instances, functions have returned back to federal facilities, back to state and local facilities. That's great. But as folks left and as folks came back, there's some things that we were doing, planning features that we were doing that have kind of been disregarded, discarded. And so current plans don't match the current reality. And I'll talk about a few of those things. So we really like physical security inspections. And so periodic inspections where a security manager and an operations manager will collaboratively walk the geographic footprint of a facility and identify potential vulnerabilities that they could elevate for management consideration, right? That is a type of inspection program, is a component of a security management plan. And that type of thing, if it was featured in the plan before COVID, it's less likely that it's still occurring since the COVID kind of shutdowns and reopening of a facility. Emergency action plans are another great one, where most facilities have an emergency action plan, right? But the emergency action plan probably doesn't, if you haven't updated it since 2020, it probably doesn't address how many of your employees have the capability to work remotely. Same thing with your continuity of operations plan. And so if you have a hybrid in-person remote workforce, on the emergency action side, it can be really difficult to determine who's in the office today, right? I have no idea who's in the office today. So which push button capabilities can I utilize to generate a roster of employees, right? And then how can I hand that over to my crisis communications coordinator to make sure that they're getting the right messages? Same thing with continuity of operations. If we're going to send folks home for a period of time, what's the order, that PACE plan, the primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency communications mechanism that we're going to use to communicate with these folks while they're home for a period of time. So updating plans is something that needs to happen. A third observation is that since we've gone home, there's been trainings. Our workforces have continued to receive training. I know that federal employees have annual training requirements. Most state and local employees have training requirements. When's the last time somebody spoke to an employee in person about threat management? So we've really pushed web-based training hard and this is not just since COVID, this is over the last 20 years, right? And so it's a great thing annually to have employees consider what they're going to do for handling severe weather events, to consider what they're going to do if they are targeted by phishing or cyber attacks, what they're going to do if there is an active assailant or an emergency, another emergency condition. For the most part, organizations, government facilities still do fire drills. So folks will still facilitate and hold fire drills to evaluate how their employees can leave the building, right? But that's not the concern that we're constantly talking about during these site assessments. So the concern is always in Washington, D.C. area, it's active assailant and it's bomb threat management. And so periodically, and maybe not every year, but periodically, it's a best practice to get in-person training for your folks to really make sure that they're cued in on this, make sure they're really dialed in on this. And so you get a law enforcement professional or a government agency professional or somebody in a security role to talk in person to your folks about roles and responsibilities associated with individual emergency action planning and considerations, right? So employees understand their role and then exercise into that periodically. And if you haven't ever done an active assailant drill or a bomb threat management drill and exercise at your organization, I suspect your facility is not going to achieve the goal that you had set for yourself, right? If you've never exercised it. And so when we hear about fire drills, we all know what that's like as a federal employee or a state employee. You walk out the building, you go and get coffee, and then you come on back. And so again, things like a standard response protocol, whether or not you're doing a hold or a shelter in place or a lockdown or an evacuation, and make sure that employees understand how and when to do that. These conversations aren't being had in a serious capacity with folks in our space, in the government facilities space. The fourth finding: standards have not been established for consistent security design. And Daryl talked about the interagency security standard. I came out of headquarters. I've been a part of Homeland Security since 2009, and this was something that was surprising to me when I made my way away from the federal community in Washington, D.C. and started working more with state and local partners. And that is to say that when you have a facility, and the facility could be a part of a network of facilities, it could be a communications hub or a cell tower, it could be a police station, it could be an office building. There's typically, if there's not the ISC standard in place, it's unlikely that there is a standard that says this is how this is the common, or excuse me, foundational, fundamental level of security capability that will be designed around this type of facility, right? And so if you're operating at the state, local, tribal, or territorial level, thinking about, have we articulated the minimum standard for security at different types of facilities? And if you have, when's the last time that you did that? And I haven't seen anybody who's put out a security standard for common types of facilities in the last 4 years. And that's just my personal observations. I haven't had a chance to query that against all my peers. But establishing standards is important, right? It gives us a baseline and then something to build off on. IT-enabled systems, IT-enabled security systems are not well understood. So there's two things. Most of our facilities now are dependent upon some sort of information technology and some sort of operational technology, ICS or SCADA systems. On the IT systems that are essential to operations, it's unlikely that our security personnel are super familiar with the components of those systems, right? And so where's the fiber line entering our facility is a great question, something that we want our security team to know. Similarly, if there are IT-enabled security capabilities, and we're talking about sensors, surveillance systems, making sure that we understand, that our security personnel understand the architecture, that enables those systems, and making sure that the IT personnel understand the criticality, have some sort of prioritized understanding of the criticality of those IT systems that are enabling security outcomes. And then the last thing that I have is prevention response capabilities rarely match industry peers, and that's not a fair statement. I should revise that one. It's just to say, in the DC area, we spend a lot of time with very wealthy clientele, and so critical infrastructures here. You understand who I'm talking about, whether it's energy providers or electricity or petroleum oil, liquid fuel providers, transportation and logistics hubs. You know who I'm talking about. It could be the Amazons of the world, or it could be the Exelons, Dominion Energy of the world. A lot of times, the office spaces housing our clients, you're talking about more modern systems. So you're talking about kind of integrated video surveillance, communications, and sensors systems with self-learning and automated cameras to notify and augment security personnel, right? And so there's no replacement for a great security officer. Don't get me wrong. But some of the capabilities that are being deployed by our peers in industry, they're just quicker to update their systems, in my experience, than what we're finding with our government partners. With just 5 minutes left, I just want to provide a note on how to engage CISA and how to find some of the resources that I alluded to today if they're new to you. I would say this: if you're operating outside of the federal space and you're interested in a comparative assessment, so we spend a lot of time on assessments for two reasons. One is to help you understand how you compare to your peers, and if you're a government facility, especially the state or local area, we're going to compare you against facilities that are compliant with the Interagency Security Committee standards, right? That have achieved that. And so that'll help you figure out, what's best in class in my industry, and what steps do I need to take to improve my comparative posture. Or another rationale for assessment is investment justification. And so we're all fighting for crumbs at the table in front of our leadership. And so sometimes trying to help somebody craft IJ for a security upgrade, that's right where we want to be. And so we're glad to help with that. If you want to learn more about these assessments, if you want to learn more about anything that CISA does, Google is the best way to find all of our stuff. So everything we do, we put it right on Google, right on the internet. And so you can Google cyber performance goals or CISA vulnerability assessments. It's going to tell you about those assessments, the criteria that we use, and how to schedule them. If you know right away you want to work with us on assessment, it's just central@cisa.dhs.gov. If you'd rather go at your own pace, and plenty of organizations do not require my security expertise, but they could use some free inspiration. You just Google CISA and then a specific security or resilience capability, a domain. It's any question. So I want to know about security planning. I want to know about emergency action plan. I want to know about communications plan. I want to exercise. You just CISA and then that topic area. Same thing on threat management for specific threats. We've put out guidance about almost every kind of threat imaginable: insider threat, active shooter, vehicle ramming, UAS, drones. Everyone's focused on drones right now. And so what are best practices for government facilities, when we don't operate in a counter drone capability? So what's the difference between counter drone capability and an anti-drone system, right? One is observe and report, and the other one shoot them out of the sky, right? But how do I make sure that I'm speaking the best language on that, or any other kind of niche threats? Space weather is another one that, as satellite communications become more essential, we're trying to put out information to make sure that everyone's increasing their level of education on these things. So, folks, that's my presentation, and I know that I ran about 3 minutes longer than I wanted to, so we got just a short window for questions. But Ron, I'm gonna turn it back over to you in case anything comes up.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. No, you're good. We're good on timing, so appreciate lots of great information there. So let me start by asking a couple questions that I asked Daryl after the last session. You talked about engagement, and if any facilities are interested in having CISA do an assessment. What about security solutions providers who might want to work with CISA as technical experts, SMEs? Is there an opportunity for that?
Yeah. We're really jealous of industry, the cutting edge industry solutions. So we want to be aware of these things, and so we work with solutions providers, research and development organizations. So something, for instance, would be we're going through DHS S&T right now to get additional information on industry best practices for the identification of incendiary devices in advance of the upcoming Club World Cup in 2025. So folks bring gas canisters and fireworks. It's a part of soccer culture, apparently, to bring these devices in. And we're concerned that that stadium operators the weapons detection systems that they deploy aren't going to be sufficient here, and we don't have the throughput of dogs available to detect these explosive devices. And so so we would typically use S&T to kind of elicit information about industry. But candidly, if you're in the industry side and you have solutions that are novel solutions, or you just want to pass business cards, we're interested in knowing who you are, what services you provide, and what industry best practices look like. So you can engage us at the local level. Like, hey, if you're on here with me, just email dangenowitz@cisa.dhs.gov, and I'm glad to make your acquaintance. Or you can work to a local CISA person anywhere at central.cisa.gov.
All right, excellent. All right, and then the other question. So Daryl, of course, talked about hybrid work, mobile work, and you touched on that a bit. So what does that mean now, this new normal for the way people are working, especially in the federal environment for cybersecurity and for insider threats, for that matter?
Well, on the cybersecurity side, it means get ready. Only 3 years later, your personal routers are going to start being targeted. by our adversaries, right? And so what does it mean? It means that you can't take your situational awareness and security oriented hat off when you walk out the door anymore at work. Your folks are going to be targeted at home. It means on the cyber side, network segmentation is probably a good idea. Cyber hygiene at your home is probably just as important as cyber hygiene at your industry. I hate the term spear phishing, but you understand what it means. Whaling. Your leadership is going to be we all know how it is. Our leadership is the least likely to take cybersecurity seriously. Well, not at CISA. Our leadership takes it really seriously, but at a lot of your facilities. So understanding that they need to set up their home network with as much security rigor behind it as they do with their remote network. On the physical security side, though, like I said, a real concern that I have is about accountability. And at DHS and most federal partners, we have kind of regular and routine accountability drills to determine how to push information when we need to push information to folks. But as I span outwards in the national capital region, and this includes federal partners outside of DC, but in the national capital region, this includes state partners and really important government partners at the city level. It's a real concern about how to push information to folks when you don't know where they are at any given time. And so again, 4 years ago, it was just easy to assume that from 9 to 5, I was responsible for securing and locking down folks within a physical footprint, a geographic footprint. And today we've got this distributed workforce. And so what? We need our folks thinking about personal security considerations. And again, our agency's putting out personal security considerations for critical infrastructure workers. So hey, look, if there's not a security manager at your home, you're the security manager at home now. And then also, you can see on the slide, I've got that PACE plan, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. But that's a really important thing. I'm just thinking about how to push notification in a way that's structured, and who's going to do that, when we need accountability if something is going to happen at our facility. So there's lots of considerations for the new world. Of course, us federal facility workers, we're all going to be working out of the office soon, so one less complexity there. But this problem is going to persist for our union colleagues and state and local folks for a lot longer.
All right, I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. I hope our next panelist will forgive me. So referring to something you just mentioned, is there direction for how to segment home networks?
Yeah. So it's another one. It's just Google CISA cybersecurity for home, and there's a whole resource guide on effective practices for that.
All right, excellent. And here's one that asks for some prognostication on your part. So, do you see potentially less federal government security opportunities for integrators in the DMV area with the new administration taking over in a month? I'm referencing the potential reductions in the local federal workforce and the moving or elimination of some governmental agencies.
Yeah, all politics aside, it seems like a good time to be in the security industry, and so that's a glass half full or glass half empty statement. I'm always optimist, so walk with me on this one. But I believe that there are some significant challenges. Talk about VUCA world and volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. You talk about nation state competition in the Middle East and between Russia and Ukraine. You talk about soft cyberspace conflict with China. And then, of course, you talk about emerging threats and what we're seeing right now with unmanned aerial systems and drones. And again, I don't have enough information or intelligence to say whether or not, it's hysteria or a valid concern. But across the board, there's a requirement for more security and for folks to be thinking more proactively about managing these forthcoming threats. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize, kind of the this requirement to be proactive in our industry space, in the security industry space, to think about really lighting a fire under our backsides about sharing information, best practices, re-engaging our peers. So on the discussion about drones, especially, the only way we can learn about these things is to talk with one another about it, because there isn't a perfect playbook right now. You either have right now counter drone capabilities, and so your Customs or Border Patrol or or the Coast Guard or the FBI and a handful of government agencies that can actually shoot down drones, and the rest of us are trying to figure out, okay, how do we advise state and local law enforcement partners? How do we advise critical infrastructure partners? How do we advise workforces or even our personnel? And of course, in Maryland, it was our former Governor Hogan, who had spotted drones over his house. So how do we advise these folks to take action to protect their privacy and to protect their property and obviously keep themselves safe? And the answer is just not out there yet. And so the only way we're going to get to the right answer is by pushing collaboration in spaces like these. And so yeah, I'm optimistic, though. Obviously I believe that as a society, the United States and the security industry in the society is ready to meet these challenges, but I'm not concerned about the market turning the tap off on security for us.
All right. One last question, and it's a quick one, then I'll let you go. We had a request for you to repeat your email address, please.
Oh yeah. Mine is just it's Daniel.Genoa, and I'll go ahead and put it in the chat. And like I said, I sure appreciate to meet any industry reps in the DC area. And if you are not in the DC area and you're looking to get onto your cyber or physical security advisor, it's central@CISA.DHS.gov. And Ron, I don't have access, I don't think, to the group chat, but if you could just put my email in there, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't think I can send the chat to all attendees, just to panelists. So,
okay.
So it's Daniel.Genua, Genua.
That's right. At CISA.DHS.gov.
All right, great. All right, excellent information. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Well, great panel. And like I said, I thought Daryl did a great job. So thanks for having me, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you guys.
Absolutely. Take care. All right, if I could have our next panelists turn on their microphones and cameras. And Dan, if you're still there, if you want to stop the screen sharing. Thank you for that. All right, thank you to all four of you for your patience. Appreciate it. We're starting a few minutes after schedule, but I think this will be a good discussion. So we'll be closing with four of our CM members talking about security solutions in the federal government space, the government facility space. So I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Krista, would you mind starting?
Hi, I'm Krista Decker. I'm a structural civil engineer. I work for WRA, and I'm head of their protective design group.
Great. Thank you. And Drew.
Afternoon all, Drew Weston. I'm the Director of National Accounts for MCA. We are a systems integrator for a lot of the physical security systems, radio, communications, whatever it happens to be for the marketplace.
Thanks, Drew. Sean, mind going next?
Yes, good afternoon. Sean Rice with Ameristar Perimeter Security, business development in the government space.
Thanks, Sean. And Wayne.
Hi, I'm Wayne Doris. I'm the program manager for cybersecurity for the Americas for Access Communications, and also the chair for the Cybersecurity Advisory Board for SIA. And I work with Ron on the Data Privacy Advisory Board as well.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much for all of that. So I know we have a set of questions and topics that we want to get to, but if you don't mind, I'd like to start off by asking, in light of what we just heard over the past hour from Daryl, from Dan, any thoughts on those presentations in terms of what ISC is doing, what CISA is doing, how they're all working among the agencies? Anything surprised you there?
Well, I did see a parallel topic that aligns with what we discussed yesterday in our pre-meeting, and that was the level of planning, the approach, right? And that was on one of Daniel's slides. Hopefully there's been some level of planning. And that's a huge topic of concern for us. Has a proper threat assessment been conducted? What is the threat level that we are working with, et cetera? And I know Krista's going to speak on that more so later on. And what criteria is it that we're working with? Is it UFC? Is it VA? Is it ISC? There's numerous criteria and building design specifications that we have to work with. So understanding that and where it's coming from up front is very important for us.
Yeah, another item that jumped out at me relative to our discussion yesterday was talking about how they don't always talk internally. They don't always know, the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing. I thought that was interesting that that was brought up yesterday, and they brought it up themselves today.
Yeah, and I would echo some of the stuff that that Daniel was talking about in terms of looking at even one agency but multiple geographic locations, and the fact that they don't have a consistent method in the way that they're approaching things. Some agencies, and I know Krista will talk about this a little more in a second, some of the agencies, like some of the DoD folks, they've got great documentation, great standards, great workflows and the way they approach stuff. Others not so much, and when you start getting multiple tenants in one property, it gets interesting quickly.
Right.
Yeah. I also thought it was really interesting that there was less coordination for cyber in that aspect. Like they said that any IP related physical security system, it wasn't well known or understood or documented, and whether or not the IT folks really understood the capabilities and what was there. So again, we kind of see the silos between physical security, cybersecurity, and particularly IT and OT, right? So that seemed to be pretty prevalent.
Right. Yeah.
And Ron, one thing I noticed, and well, Daryl talked about a lot of great new standards that CISA has put out. You know, the kind of the foundational one is the ISC risk management process, and you know, Appendix A, which is the design basis threat report, countermeasures, that kind of stuff that really can serve as a fundamental place to start understanding what criteria your project needs to fall into.
Right. So I think Daryl certainly, and maybe Dan as well, we're making the point that COVID really did damage those relationships and that information sharing, but they're kind of making slow progress toward you know, getting back to more productive connections. Is that something that you found in your work with government? That it took a dip during and immediately after COVID?
I certainly have, and I made the note to Dan in the chat that yes, the InfraGard has made, at least in the regions that I deal with them, has made a very big push in the back half of this year to re-engage with the community, reestablish some of those relationships between the critical infrastructure sectors and the DHS folks, and has been very active and vocal, proactively trying to reestablish some of those, recognizing that some of that was dropped through COVID and through everything being virtual.
All right, so let's get into a little bit of our plan discussion in terms of how solutions providers can work with government agencies and securing facilities. So let's begin with the design and planning process. So ISC has these documents available, this guidance available. Each department, each agency has specific criteria. So Krista, can you give us an idea of how a company can start to work through all that and work productively with security professionals at the government?
Sure. Well, you know, the government has some very well-established planning procedures that, you know, government projects are supposed to go through in order to define, you know, objectives, criteria, address threats and levels of protection that they need. And, you know, so like I said before, those methods are outlined in that risk management process. And, you know, that's where, you know, a facility has its FSL, its facility security level defined, and then you can go through the whole Appendix A thing once you know the FSL of a facility and figure out what the criteria is that facility is supposed to meet. I should point out that is different than, you know, Daniel just talked about standards. You know, design standards are different than criteria. You know, so that's something that the design process should also, you know, address if there are any standards that we need to meet. And I know Sean's going to talk about, you know, kind of typical perimeter procedures in a second here. But the one thing before I get off is I'd like to stress is that security and the security requirements for a particular project need to be baked in, I use that term, at the beginning of the project. it doesn't serve any kind of security project well, or any kind of project where security might even be, a relatively small part, doesn't serve it well to come up with the security requirements at the end of the project. If you can bake them in at the beginning, they can be you almost can't even tell they're there if you do it smart. Mr. Hernandez talked about crime prevention through environmental design, CEPTED. That's one of the objectives of that. And if people can all think about that early on in a project, no matter whether it involves fences or barriers or forced entry windows or anything like that, if you understand it at the beginning instead of trying to stick it on like a wart at the end, it'll be a much better project.
Right. Can you quickly explain the difference between standards and criteria in this context?
So criteria would be design guidance. You're trying to attain a certain performance level or something like that. A standard would be, our VCPs all look exactly like this. The guard booth all looks like this. This is a standard guard booth design. This is a standard entrance design. So those are kind of more, specific design solutions would be a standard. And everybody uses this because we know it works well. But the big thing, Ron, is that it needs to work well for your clients' procedures. You don't want to implement security design that isn't integrated with their functional procedures.
Perfect. All right. So in terms of working directly with security professionals in the government, I don't remember who said it during our prep call, but somebody said they don't know what they don't know, which I thought was a good statement. So how can solutions providers, as the tech experts, go in and build that relationship with these people who are responsible for securing buildings? What are some of the key practices and points there?
Who do you want to start, Ron?
Whoever feels most motivated. Drew, would you mind taking that one?
Yeah, I think everybody on the call, both on the presenter and the attendee side of things, would agree that the various things that fall under security now are so broad and deep that no one person can know them all. And someone may come from a particular agency or entity that has a specific requirement for a certain practice. But I mean, I will be the first to admit when it comes to like locking hardware, I'm going to pick up the phone and call some of my colleagues over at ASA because I know enough to be dangerous. But when you start getting the weeds on finishes and different factors and, okay, what do we need? Yeah, you've got to involve others to really do it at the level of detail it needs. And I see that frequently, particularly with some of the consulting guys. They are always engaging with the manufacturers for everything under the sun because they know they can't know it all. But as I think Dan mentioned previously, having those relationships to say, hey, I've got this problem that it's a video application, a locking application, guard services, whatever it happens to be, knowing who is that subject matter expert they can pick up the phone and ask those questions to.
Yeah, I think also it's developing the relationship, educating, and sometimes asking many questions, even though it seems odd. But the point is to get clarity, because to Krista's point, until you understand exactly what the criteria is or what the objectives are that we're trying to achieve, and being able to build that in from the beginning is going to save you a lot of heartache down the line and a lot of money, and particularly, the government's money. So I think that's important. So I try to go in as an advisor and also learning, particularly in the physical security and cybersecurity space. There's so many things changing. Like we said, we see new executive orders, we see new design requirements. So it's hard to be an expert on everything, but you try to keep up to date, learn, and like you said, leverage your network of experts, whether it's design consultants, other people in the industry, or even from SIA themselves. They have a lot of great resources as well.
And Ron, I'd like to elaborate on that too. I think we said yesterday, they don't know what they don't know, and nobody wants to admit what they don't know. A lot of these federal projects that we work on, I'll use a federal courthouse or a federal building as an example. You've got so many different entities involved in that project. You've got folks from GSA, you've got folks from the Office of the Courts, you've got FBI agents, you've got the federal judges. The list goes on and on. You've got the U.S. Marshals. You've got to look at each project individually and not use a holistic approach. You've got to get in there, get in front of these people and hash out exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish. Because there's just a lot of people involved in every single project, a lot of different opinions and directions that you can go in.
And what their priorities are. Those different stakeholders all may have different priorities, ranging from aesthetics to, performance-based effectiveness, like crash ratings. But one of the things we also talked about yesterday is, especially when you get in front of these stakeholders, and many of our stakeholders come prepared. They've looked at something, they've got an idea about what they want, but sometimes they come with the hybrid idea of what they want. So, for some particular, security component. And wouldn't it be great if we could get this, but if it could do that and this too? And, yesterday people talked about even seeing these kind of, hybrid specifications where certain things are taken from one manufacturer from another. And especially for things like that have to be certified, like crash ratings or, some other certifications, you have to go to the manufacturer and say, you got one of these things? Do you have something that does this? And, then you have to kind of break it to your client that, we can get close, but we can't do exactly what you want unless you want to go through the development, exercise, which would be, kind of like R&D and testing and all that kind of stuff. And hardly anybody ever has time or money to do that. And it's, it's like, helping them identify commercially available security products that achieve their objectives is a really important part of it, so that everybody understands what they're going to get or what they're trying to get. Instead of some pie in the sky, hope somebody creates it, before this bid's out, which is not a good thing to expect.
Right.
Yeah,
Or I
Ron.
want it commercially off the shelf, but I also want it custom for me. So I get that one a lot.
Yeah,
That's a
Ron, as
good
Krista
point.
and Wayne were saying, if you can get ahead of it, ask those open-ended questions, understand the requirements, as I think Wayne said, it will certainly make it a lot less heartache down the road, and it will absolutely reduce the cost. But yeah, I've definitely seen some of those, Wayne, where, yeah, I need a class 1 Div 1 solution that is commercially off the shelf, 2 weeks lead time. I can load my own AI models on it, and I need it all for under $1,500.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. It's never a one-off transactional situation. It's always a consultative situation.
All right, Sean, let me stick with you to start with this next question. So basically, the first line of physical defense is the perimeter, essentially. So I'll start things off very broadly. Can you just talk about a few of the key factors, a few of the key things that you look at for perimeter security for government buildings?
Well, there's many factors to take into consideration. We'll start off with, what type of facility are we working with? And, what is the asset that we're protecting? Is it a federal building? Is it a DOE nuclear facility? Is it a low-level admin building that's not housing many state secrets? You need to understand exactly what the audience is. And then number two, understanding things such as, standoff distance. If it's a site that needs to be very secure, what is the distance from the perimeter to that asset that we're trying to protect? And from there, we can ascertain whether it's a crash-rated system that needs to be installed, whether it's just a high security fence that needs to be installed, whether we need vehicle barriers, whether we need to develop access control points. So there's a lot that goes into it, but just realizing, identifying exactly what the asset is that we're protecting right up front and understanding their needs.
Right. So Krista was talking about design and planning. I imagine for a new building, it's one thing, but when you're looking at an old building, like especially a really old building with legacy systems in there, that presents its own set of challenges. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's it. Actually, personally, I think it's more challenging and sometimes way more difficult to deal with an existing facility than to come up with a brand new, design. Mm-hmm. So existing facilities, you have to do pretty often. You have to do a fairly extensive site survey, understand the systems you've got, like electrical capability, where your panels are, where your comms have to go for whatever security component you've got. And running new conduit across a parking lot or up, the spine of a building can be a fairly, costly enterprise. And a lot of people forget about stuff like that. It's just like, hey, I got this camera. It costs $1,500. I want it installed. Well, the conduit could easily cost $1,500 to have the conduit installed, maybe even more. And just the cost of copper to get the power to it could be that much, depending on the distance you've got to run. So, as Sean talked about before, you have to think about your project, from a beginning and end, and kind of holistically, that it's got to have systems, it's got to have connectivity, and you've got to figure all of that out. But one other thing, Ron, I wanted to touch on is, especially for either new or existing, is that there will be building code and site code and NFPA code and NEC code that you've got to comply with, depending on what your device is. When we get into things like doors or access control and turnstiles and things like that, then you have to worry about egress. So it's really important, if your project has any level of complexity to it, that you engage a design professional, so that you're not disappointed at the end of these, where you have a solution that you think suits your objective, but then it turns out it's not compliant with whatever building code, site code, whatever it is you need. And tied to that, not federal buildings, but state, local, that kind of things, you're also going to need to get permits. And that checking of the design code, certification that you meet it, is all going to be required to get the permits you need to break ground and build your project.
Yeah, Crystal, we've seen that a lot, where if you've got historic structures, where if it's a very old building, even more modern buildings, but by more modern thinking, things that were built post-World War II, some of the building materials that they use now can't be used today. You've got lead paint, you've got asbestos. I've looked at individual projects where I was chatting with the team yesterday. Someone wanted to put a intercom in a vault because they were worried about something getting locked in the vault. And we basically said, guys, you've got a 3-foot thick piece of steel surrounded by lead paint and asbestos. That one intercom that's going to cost you, to Krista's point, $1,500 is going to cost me $100,000 to install. So there's a lot to that. And like I said, if you look at historic structures where it's on the historic register, and it's, again, you've got a lot of stone work and things like that, the installation task gets exponentially harder. But anytime you do touch those systems, you also do have the aspect of, okay, now I do have to bring this up to code, and that is today's code. We've seen a lot of that on the communication side, where, as Krista said, some NFPA, NEC updates have been made, where, like on public safety radios, for example, any building over 25,000 square feet has to have a minimum level of functionality for those public safety radios. So law enforcement, first responders, everybody can operate those inside a building. It doesn't matter what type of building it is, if it's over that. And we are seeing a lot of AHJs that, as they incorporate those new updates to those codes, are going back and doing inspections of some of those buildings. And it's a pretty easy inspection. You walk around, does my radio work or not? If it doesn't, we need to have a conversation.
All right. So Wayne, Krista mentioned video. So how are government security professionals approaching the use of video and analytics at their facilities?
Well, yeah, there's a lot under you that they had pointed out that there was a lot of rework, right? Some stuff's still analog, which we've talked about, but people are excited about analytics and video surveillance, and also not just video analytics, but also other sensor data like radar. Let's take a perimeter, for example, using the metadata to understand what types of traffic or vehicle people are coming along through there, get that metadata and understand your traffic pattern across your perimeter, what's happening there, but also radar data to know, yes, we have a barrier, but wouldn't it be nice to know that there was a car ramping up already at 60 miles an hour further out, and we know that that's out of spec from the normal 20, 30 mile an hour that we see, just to help lend more criteria to that, right? And also, that's where people want to leverage it as secondary. Yes, we have a perimeter system, we have a notification there, but yes, we also have notification from the video system for that. So we see a lot of it can be pie in the sky, but in their refresh cycle, definitely analytics are topic, the use of AI and how much of it is used on the edge versus how much of it is used in the cloud or versus the on-prem system specifically just to do analytics. So like we said, we get a lot of that's where we also get a lot of we just mesh a lot of things together that we want and put it out in a spec and hope something can meet for it. But I think a lot of times they don't look at for analytics. It also takes a lot of time to set it up, to continually tune it as things change over environments. And sometimes those costs aren't taken into account off the get-go. And I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah. Do you find that they're actually using the analytics, or is it just a want to have, just in case?
Certain ones do want to use them, but where always you get into the analytic problem is how reliable is it, right? So false positives, and so depending on how reliable it can be, will depend on whether or not they really embrace it. But typically, most analytics are going to have some certain scenarios that it's not going to be 100%. So you have to bake that expectation in with the client up front, right? And particularly do plenty of testing well ahead of time to ensure that it's going to meet the environment that it's going in. So.
And Ron, we see the particular systems that Wayne was talking about, over speed and wrong way, that are based on radar. That's pretty much a DoD standard. We see them using that coupled with license plate readers too, depending on if they have enough standoff to get that camera out there, so that they actually have run the license plate number before the car rolls up. So and depending on if they're showing up with their badge or they're pretending it's a toll booth and trying to get into the facility, having that license plate number and knowing what they've been up to is a really important tool for the security officers standing at that post.
All right. So, of course, with the IP cameras, with all the functionalities they provide, that does raise the cybersecurity issue along with other network connected security devices. So, is the government doing enough to address cybersecurity concerns, or is it still siloed like you see in so many other places between physical and cyber?
It's still siloed, but I am seeing more convergence, and I'm also seeing obviously the emphasis. Probably the greatest emphasis came out of Executive Order 14028, right? That was a broad sweeping executive order after SolarWinds, where pretty much it mandated zero trust architectures, mandated multi-factor authentication on all of your systems. But some of the other lesser known things that also happened out of that executive order were SBOMs, software bill of materials. In other words, every software that's even on an IP camera or an access control system, every component that is used in that, so they have a repository of it. And also now you're getting tasked with having to perhaps write attestations to certain agencies for your adherence to the secure software development framework. So much to Krista's point, where if we can build security in up front from a physical side, it's the same way with secure by design or security by design in software as well. And the US government wants to have that in their SSDF attestation. So a lot of manufacturers are probably could be getting caught off guard with that. But that is something that is forthcoming. I would be remiss if I didn't mention on this webinar that obviously encryption will be very interesting in the next couple of years, just due to quantum. But beyond that, in September of 2026, FIPS 140-2 is end of life. So FIPS 140-3, which is the Federal Information Protection Processing Systems regulation. This is a major thing. They hadn't EOL'd a FIPS 140 standard since 2001. So FIPS 140-2 had a good 25-year run, and that is coming to the end here in 2026. Now that means current systems that are on FIPS 140-2 can continue to work, but if they're purchasing, they need to be FIPS 140-3, which is the new standard, which when we get into certifying for FIPS 140-3 through the NIST CPVM process, you want to be working with your manufacturers and understand, hey, what is your runway? Is it going to be a chipset change? Is it a software change? How do you plan on supporting the new FIPS 140-3 mechanisms in your product? It's a good conversation to have because we're coming up on 2025 and that's less than a year. So.
Yeah, Wayne, and I've seen the same thing in terms of a lot of these systems where they used to be on island networks, they are no longer. And I think as Sean and Wayne both mentioned that if you want all the LPR and things like that to work and have the hot list and all that, those systems have to be connected in order to be able to get some of that information. And I've had federal customers tell me that over the life cycle of that product, they expect the cyber level of effort to be 50% of the level of effort. It's not just install it, walk away, and don't touch it again. You have to patch it. You have to have those attestations and that documentation trail so that if there is a CVE, we know where we've got it in our infrastructure. So we can either limit it, patch it, whatever we need to do to respond to it. So that is something that we are definitely seeing more of. There are still certainly a lot of island systems out there that aren't connected, but the trend is very much to running it on those IT/OT networks and hardening them appropriately.
Yep. And I think like Daryl mentioned from the, a bad termination, the expectation that within 18 hours, your logical access is automatically removed, which makes sense on the IT side and maybe on the VMS and the access control head-in, because that supports Active Directory. But what about individual admin levels for cameras and edge devices? Yeah, we're going to see federal agencies pushing for more central management of entities, users, and obviously passwords and everything else. So.
All right. So, Sean, one thing I wanted to touch on that we talked about briefly yesterday is once you get inside that initial perimeter access control points. So you have all these technologies coming together, and how do you control access? What are some of the key things to consider there?
Once again, the threat level, that has been assessed, the asset you're trying to protect, vehicle entry. Do you have multiple lanes of entry? How many vehicles are coming in and out per day? What number of personnel security do we have on site to process those vehicles? So many factors to take into account there.
And Rob, I should also add there that we were yesterday in our call, we talking about this is government issues, not DOD, federal government versus DOD. But when you're talking about things like you were just asking Sean about access control points for vehicles, there's very good prescriptive guidance in the UFC series from DOD, 422, 4022, 01, 2, and 3 deal with the VCC, the vehicle barriers, and any kind of fence. And while you don't necessarily have to follow those if you're not DOD, there's lots of good guidance and information about what you should be worrying about and how you should be sizing those things.
And another thing that's important that we touched on briefly earlier is what is the vehicular approach? What does that look like? How long is that runway? What speed can a vehicle get up to? And then you can determine from there what the necessary crash rating to be met should be. And we do see discrepancies there quite often. Sometimes you'll see crash ratings that are way overboard, and sometimes you'll see some that are insufficient. So it's important to understand the approach and the entry point itself.
Yep. And that vector, there's a procedure for doing we call it the vector analysis that Sean just described in those UFCs. So you can kind of follow along. There's some, equations from high school physics that you can, kind of bring out and plug some variables in and figure it out. It's not super complicated, but it's, as Sean says, it's really important to match your threat level with your solution because, and Sean can attest to this, when we talk about some of the crash-rated components that are, for instance, have a P1 rating, their foundations are much more robust, deeper, or bigger than those things for like a K4 P2 or something like that. So when we start talking the most robust component, we really need to know that the site really needs that, because fitting those foundations in and installing those things can be particularly challenging because they're big, robust, difficult to fit between your infrastructure, that kind of stuff. So, you really have to kind of commit, if you want one of those very high rated perimeters. Otherwise, there will be problems along the way.
All right, Drew, to get back to comms. So yesterday you mentioned a tragic incident. I think it was in Charleston, where some firefighters perished because of the lack of radio communication. So how can you ensure that is available given the variety of structures and the walls that have to be penetrated? It seems very complex.
Yeah, that is one of the things that the IFC standards started to be updated in 2009. There was a Charleston, South Carolina's home for me. There was a fire in a large warehouse type building that was a furniture store. And basically the firefighters on the outside saw the roof coming in and were screaming on the radios, but the guys inside, the signal wasn't penetrating, so they couldn't hear all of their colleagues outside saying, get out, get out, get out, and the roof came down on them. So that was a very unfortunate thing. But one of the good things that has come of it is, yes, that between looking back to like September 11th and that particular incident, having good ability for comms to get inside so the law enforcement can get in there. As I said, as a lot of AHJs have updated their acceptance of some of those new, more modern versions of the NFPA, the NEC, things like that, it's brought those standards into force. But basically, you can do an assessment and essentially scan the building for those public safety frequencies and see if you've got the right penetrations. Obviously, you can get into some stuff, particularly in skiffs and things like that, Faraday cages, where, okay, there are some specific cases where we can't have those comms going in and out of there. So you do have to have some other life safety conversations about how do we evacuate the space? How do we remediate the space? But basically, you need to do an assessment of the facility, figure out what the infrastructure looks like. Where does it work? Where does it not? Maybe we need to do some amplification. And it all varies case by case, building by building. A lot of it depends on the materials used, what other structures are there, what are the interior structures. I'm looking at a bunch of shelving right now. Okay, is it wood shelving versus metal shelving? It's going to have an impact on the way that the RF moves in those spaces.
All right. Thanks for that. All right, so we do have a couple questions, so let me get to those. So this first one, I don't know that this would fall into any of your areas, but we'll ask it anyway. Is there any talk around the industry about integrating robotics for security, such as drones and mobile robots/devices?
There's lots of talk for it. I'll say there's a lot of use cases that are being explored and tested, and I'll say it's we're seeing more and more of that request coming forward.
I have used several different systems where we're using video and perimeter systems as a input to basically a dispatch operation for a drone solution. I've seen lots of people playing with the Boston Dynamics dog. I've never seen it used in production anywhere, but I've seen some of the autonomous and semi-autonomous robotics or drones that have been used to support perimeter security systems, particularly when you've got a large central structure. So when you're talking hundreds of acres, logistics facilities, big warehouse facilities, with the big structure in the middle, if you've got a guard on the property, to get to the other side could be a 10-minute vehicle drive. A drone can be there in 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question. Similar to how threat vector analysis may be important to identifying a crash standard, what best practices are there in identifying a forced entry rating on a perimeter fence?
Well, actually, just there happens to be a procedure that talks about kind of the forced entry rating for a whole facility in UFC 402601. You typically don't think of. Ron, could you read that question again one more time?
Yep. Similar to how threat vector analysis may be important to identifying a crash standard, what best practices are there in identifying a forced entry rating on perimeter fence?
So the methodology I just talked about in 402601 would tell you the response time that you would need, to respond to a certain threat to get through the building. You typically don't think of offenses as forced entry because you can go over them. You don't have to go through them. But usually forced entry solutions are a number of things: a door, a window, a wall, a fence. And the thing about the fence is it gives you some response time before you get to your second layer of, that your assailant would be trying to get through. But look at 402601. It gives you some outlines about, how to figure that out.
Yeah, but I think what he was getting at as well is, there's differences in infills and high security fences, right? And they have been tested to different standards. And we know that it may take 2 minutes to get through this infill as opposed to 5 minutes for this infill. So if you're in a small urban block, let's say with 24-hour surveillance and security on site, then you're most likely going to be able to react much quicker. And you may not need that stronger infill, whether you have a large rural campus that cannot be easily surveyed. So it's a fair question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Krista and Sean. So those are actually all the questions we have. Oh, wait, we just had a couple more pop up. I spoke too soon. Somebody commented on Sean's answer. That's also speaking to cut-through rate as well.
Yep. Well, that's my colleague. Yeah. So, yep, she's
right.
It's on the same lines. Yes.
Exactly. And then a comment here. The CIA Perimeter Security group is working on establishing a baseline standard for force entry resistance of fence products. And your colleague chairs the CIA Perimeter Security Working Group. So appreciate that. All right, so that, I believe, is all the questions that we have. So with that having been said, just to wrap things up, I'd like to go around the room, see what closing comments you have, and we'll go in reverse order from how we started. So Wayne, would you mind leading us off this time?
Sure. Obviously, from the cybersecurity part, you will see that it is now becoming standard that you will have to meet the requirements as per the different levels of facilities. The different levels of cybersecurity requirements will depend on what part of the government sector that you're deploying in. But you will be requested for how to harden, how to work with different encryptions, how to work with account management, Active Directory, those types of things. Get used to it. Get used to having more documentation at the time of procurement for it based on the cybersecurity side. And so work with manufacturers that can provide you that kind of data up front.
Sean?
It's very important to get to know the audience that you're working with and really truly understanding what it is they're trying to accomplish. We talked about how many different entities are involved in any single project. And we also stated that agencies do not communicate with each other, but they often don't communicate very well internally either. So you've got to understand your individual audience per project.
And Drew.
Yeah, kind of tagging on to what Wayne said. A lot of the stuff most people are already doing and doing decent at. But one of the things you will notice, particularly in this federal space, is that the documentation requirements get a lot higher. So yes, you may have good cyber hygiene. You're now having to produce an audit trail, documentation trail, a set of artifacts to demonstrate the compliance, whether that's cyber, whether that's in-building communications, whatever it happens to be. It is a lot of work to keep up with that documentation exercise.
And Krista, if you could bring us home.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about is kind of, if you've got a project, what the procurement approach is. If you're looking at particular security components like an Ameristar fence or a certain camera, as a design project manager or as a designer like myself, you need to understand if your contracting officer or whoever is in charge of purchasing will allow you to sole source that project or that component, or whether it has to be performance based. How that procurement is going to work, whether you already have somebody picked out to do it and they're on an on-call contract, or whether it's going to be completely bid out. And I know from experience that a lot of security professionals don't want to give out the requirements of their security protective systems. You don't want to spill the beans on exactly how your camera system works or your access control system. So this is an area that needs to be kind of worked through before you get to the to the final documents of your project.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. So, all right, want to thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. That's a fantastic discussion. A lot of really good insights. Appreciate your time. And also thank our previous panelists, Daryl Hernandez and Dan Genua. Appreciate their time as well. And thank all of you for joining us, who logged on today for the past couple of hours. And of course, thank you to our sponsors, Ameristar and Access Communications. Very grateful for their support. So this is our last Vertical Insights Symposium of 2024. We did 5 this year. We have 7 planned for next year. The first will be looking at critical infrastructure security. We'll be holding that in February. So watch for an announcement regarding the exact day and the participants in that session. We hope you'll be able to join us. So thank you.